Okay guys, so welcome everyone to Vibe today. So this will go out on Facebook Live, so just to be aware that your images will be possibly on the internet, but used in a nice way. There are no fire exits in this shop, basically. If you want to escape, go that way. All right, so without further ado, so this is Patrick Dransfield from Ham Tin, photographer, and today he's going to do a presentation about his start of photography life, I suppose, in 1986, Beijing. He's got probably 30 or 40 minutes of slides to run through. Keep all the questions to the end, and then we can do a Q&A with Patrick. And with that, I welcome Patrick.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thanks for showing up on a bit of a wet day. And Phil and Gary, thank you very much indeed for the invitation. It's brilliant to be here. What I'd like to do in the next, I think, about 25, 30 minutes is share those photographs from 1986.
Oh, really? Should we stop and start?
Background on those. My wife is here, Carmen, and I have our 3 kids now in the UK. So I came across this big bag of negatives. I kind of knew they were there, but I really needed a guy to be able to straighten them, because they're all very tightly rolled as they were from the darkroom in Beijing, and then scan them. So 2 years ago, that's the beginning of me being able to look at maybe 800 images actually. I mean, I spent 3 or 4 months cycling around China. I was in a bit of an unusual position in terms of the fact that I was living with a Chinese family in a place called Zhongguancun. Zhongguancun, for those that know Beijing, is in the far north of Beijing. To live with a Chinese family was actually highly unusual. I won't go into all the details as to why that happened, but there I was. I was teaching English at Beishida, which is a university in the northwest of Beijing. And then I had a job, which was probably the best job I ever had, which was reading newspapers for Newsweek. And they actually did pay people to do that in those days. US dollars. So I was in a great shop, a great place, and I was cycling maybe 40 kilometers a day. I'm kind of running forward a little bit, but I'll just talk a little bit about the camera and then we'll get into the slides and what have you, because this is in a way the star of the show, and I'm happy to pass this around. The reason that the photographs you're going to see and which are in the book are a little bit unusual is really this camera. And what happened was I'd wrecked my other camera, which was a color camera, Nikon, and I didn't have a lot of money. So I was walking along Wanfujing, which in those days was still the Oxford Road of Beijing, but in those days didn't have too much. It had the bookshop, it had the hat shop, it had this pawn shop where you could buy cheap goods, right? And so I bought this at 100 renminbi. Actually, that was a quarter of my salary at the time, so it wasn't a light purchase, but I thought, okay, well, I bought it. How on earth do I use this thing, right? There was no light meter, so I had to guess the kind of all the settings and everything else like that. But it also took me back to when I first started photography, which was when I was 15. And my dad had bought me a Zenith EM camera for my birthday. And it looked great, but actually the light meter in the Zenith EM is on the top. It's not actually through the lens metering. It's a real cheat, actually. And if you don't know that, and there was nobody in Runcorn where I was brought up to actually tell me, you kind of take pictures of the sky, really, and then, of course, everything down below is completely dark. So my dad christened me the worst photographer in the world. Right. He did actually say he was the worst harmonica player, so he was quite fair. But that was my rather inauspicious start. When I'd actually started on cameras, it actually kind of worked. I got a lot better. But as I'll explore, actually, I'm also very much inspired by fine art. You know, my mum and dad, and I'll show a picture of mum and dad in a minute, were brought up in Yorkshire. They're from Yorkshire, but we were in the northwest of England. And my dad was a keen amateur winemaker. So we always used to go to these wine shows in provincial England, and my mum and I would go to all the local art galleries. And so from about the age of 6 or 7, I kind of got used to going to art galleries, and that became something which I ended up studying art history at one time and all the rest of it. So if I've ever got any advice, particularly to younger photographers, is to actually look at the art, for, you know, the artists and the painters first. And you'll see some of the pictures that I think I was kind of inspired with subconsciously as well. So this is a camera, and the reason that it's the star of the show is that, as you can see, I can be looking at you guys in the eyes, and actually taking a picture. So a lot of the pictures are very different. A lot of people actually ask me, particularly, people who've got used to iPhones all their lives, right? And we, I guess, are pretty much into that habit. They say, do these people pose for these pictures? Were they happy to have these pictures taken? How are they coming about? And I think there's several points on that which I'd like to kind of clear up right at the beginning. First off, everybody kind of liked having their photograph if it's not an offensive kind of way, because actually, if we can, even those of us at a certain age, if we cast our minds back, and I know that there were no photographs from my time as an undergraduate at Leeds University. Taking a photograph was actually quite a major thing, even in our lifetimes, or some of our lifetimes. Nowadays, everybody's got an iPhone, so we're all used to snapping away. But in those days, and in China in 1986, it was even more the case. People really rarely saw a camera, and it was the kind of thing that as a sort of middle class person you would aspire to. So you get the bike to get the girlfriend, and then you'd get married, and then she'd buy some jewelry and you'd buy a watch, and then the next thing you'd do is buy one of these, and this was quite a common camera at the time, and that was to take a photograph of your one child to share with the grandparents. So that's in a way a little bit of a description as to why I think my photographs are a little bit different. Three things really. I was cycling around, I was not in the usual parts of Beijing, and also I went to Datong and kind of hung around to the places which were not the usual places. China itself, which I'll explore a little bit with some parallels to what I'll talk about as liminal moments in history. China itself in 1986 was certainly at a liminal point in history. It was 10 years from the Cultural Revolution. People, even those that had been very badly struggled against during the Cultural Revolution, were giving a sigh of relief and thinking, okay, maybe life can be normal now. So there was a kind of collective view that the future was going to be better. The present was okay, the future was going to be better. If you can cast your minds back a little bit also, 86 is before the big economic rise of China. So it was still, there are photographs in here which I'll show you, which are kind of historic in a way, because the first free market in Beijing and things like that were evidence then. But the big rise in the economy of China didn't happen until 1991, 92, and then upwards from there. So still things were pretty on a level, but people had hope, and it was a very liminal time, and I'll talk about that word a little bit. But if you'd like to, if anybody would like to take a look at the camera, you're more than welcome to pass it around, and then I'll carry on. So as I promised, I share a picture of my parents, and there they are on the Lee River. I don't know if anybody's been there. Okay, and they're from Yorkshire, and I wasn't born in Yorkshire, and that seemed a problem for them. Huddersfield. Right? So they'd say, oh, he wasn't born in Huddersfield, he wasn't born in Yorkshire, he's not really a Yorkshireman. So I'm not sure why I'm mentioning that, but anyway, I managed to get that out of my system almost. I did a kind of whole Yorkshire sat-nav kind of stand-up routine about not coming from Yorkshire at the FCC, etc. But they're responsible really for many things, and one of them is, as I mentioned, my dad getting me the camera to set me off going with photography. And as I go through the photographs in 1986, I'll also bring in some pictures of Lantau, because I've been lucky enough to be coming to Lantau for over 30 years. We first came when we weren't living in Hong Kong, but around about early 90s. And this is one I took about 20 years ago. And anybody guess where this is? Puyo? Yeah, perfect, yeah. And what I love about Puyo is that you get this kind of total mirror effect around about 5 o'clock in the evening, because of course, as you know, and people probably know a lot more than I do, but it's volcanic sand. Somehow there was a volcano nearby. So that with the water makes a mirror. And there we are. So this is actually hanging, this is available for buying if you're interested, okay. Yeah. And the same picture is hanging at the Hong Kong International Arbitration Centre with 9 other ones. And if you're interested in this symbol, I use the theme of the Wu Xing, the 5 elements of the Chinese beliefs of how the universe is constructed, and that of course is Earth, so that one represented Earth. So I've talked a little bit about being the worst photographer and the Zenith EM. I think the other aspect to that camera, which is now being passed around, is that because I didn't have a light meter, and because I'd used this really cumbersome Soviet camera before, 2 things really. I was quite happy with the idea of using primitive equipment. Even cameras those days were all film cameras, right? So you would have to set the aperture and everything else like that. But most were more automatic and had light meters. I got quite used to using really primitive equipment, and my heroes actually of photography, and I'll talk about my heroes in art in a minute, but my heroes in photography are people like Bill Brandt. And when Bill Brandt was taking photographs, he's Austrian, he came over to the UK in the 1920s. The very early photographs he took and the portraits he took, he actually used his hand as an aperture. So this is actually quite sophisticated comparative to what Bill had to use. And you'll see a couple of pictures of Bill's as we go along. So in a way, we're going to go on a little bit of a journey in terms of time. I hope you don't mind, but we're going to talk about 1911 and congruence, 1911 to 1914 and congruence, 1986 liminality, 220 liminality, and hopefully congruence now. And the reason I chose 1911 to 1914 is because I believe this was a period of time which is famous for cubism. Everybody's familiar perhaps with the word cubism. But this was a period of Western history and Western thought where change was definite and definitely happening. So at the same, and we'll see some of these images, but when we get to Picasso and Braque and the invention of cubism, it's going away from a kind of pictorial image, a monofocal image. It's actually saying that the canvas can be made up of anything in multiple perspectives. Okay, and as I'll explore, photography and fine art have actually been twinned for a very, very long time. Since the 15th century, people have actually been using devices like this, not necessarily with film, but devices like this to look on the world so that you have one monofocal perspective on it. So it was actually in 1911 to 14 where Picasso and Braque actually broke that way of looking at the world, and they were joined at that time also by Stravinsky in music. They were joined by Einstein in physics, and also Freud. If you think about that period of time, everything was in change. And I'll make the point that in 1986 in China, quite a lot of other points were in change as well. It was a very different kind of vibe going on. Now, when we talk about liminality is an anthropological phrase actually, and it refers to a point where you're the threshold of change. Usually it refers to, in anthropology, to a kind of rite of passage. It could be a christening, it could be some kind of, I don't know, getting drunk on tequila at college or something, but there is some idea that you go through a process and then you're changed as a result of it. And then obviously in 2020 we can all feel that we've been through a process. I mean, everybody in the world has had to cope with the COVID-19 crisis, and I'm hoping that we're at a point of congruence for 2021, because congruence and emergence, another word, emergence, they have very special meanings. And emergence is where science and arts merge together and actually hope to bring global solutions. So these are the sort of some of the dates and times I'd like to put you in mind of as we go through these pictures actually. So this is the first one, which I think a lot of people have been familiar with. It's on the front cover of the book. What I'd like to talk about is why it works as an image and kind of tie up some of these thoughts about fine art to this image, if you like. So as you can see, it's actually got this monofocal kind of construction to it, this idea of an infinite point. And this is very typical of the art up until the early 20th century, from the 15th century to the early 20th century. And this is why photography and art are so closely twinned. Now, it's actually David Hockney who's talked a lot about how actual fine artists used photography equipment. Okay, so this is an example of Piero della Francesca. Now, he's using this idea of symmetry and focus in that kind of way for a religious purpose, right? This is definitely an image of resurrection, and obviously you've got the Trinity, and this construction is very much mathematical. So this is an idea of congruence, very much a mathematical kind of construct. Now, this is Bill Brandt. I did say I would show you some pictures related to Bill Brandt, and I was going to mention, I've gone a bit ahead of myself, but why he's one of my heroes. In fact, actually, when I was 15, I went from, who's from England here, by the way? Anybody put their hand up? Okay, so when I was living in Runcorn, near Liverpool, going down to London was quite a big deal. And also, for whatever reason, I had like 10 pence in my pocket, right? Very little. I went to McDonald's and I said, could I have fish and chips? And they said, no, we don't do fish and chips. I mean, this is how kind of green I was. And I did spend whatever money I had to go and see the Bill Brandt exhibition, which was when I was about 15. So check him out. He's one of the greats. Now, this one is a little street by Vermeer. And what I want to show you here is a picture I took in Beijing, which I was actually quite amazed when I was looking at this, because if you see, this is almost identically the same. Now, this is a Ming Dynasty hutong. I mean, many of them are gone now, but the fact that they had, I'll just go back to that Vermeer. Sorry, we've gone ahead of ourselves. You got that kind of construction, that gate, and this sort of stillness. And obviously, I think Vermeer would have been a great photographer. I mean, he's obviously creating photographic images, if you like. And he did use the camera obscura. And this is a picture I took in Beijing at the time I was describing. Now, this one is Folie Bergère by Manet. And this one is Shop Girl after Manet. Now, what I quite like about this as an image is that basically she's selling baijiu, right? So there you are. But you could get some bananas as well, right? And if you look here, this is very typical of that period of time in Beijing and China generally. These kind of Soviet lights, which are very much like a kind of spaceship. That was very typical of the sorts of, paraphernalia that were around.
I find baijiu and bananas are an excellent pairing.
Yeah, absolutely. I still have it every morning.
Yes.
This is Rembrandt, beautiful etching, Christ healing or teaching, I think, the healing. And then this is Winter Cabbages, 1986. Now, anybody who was around in China in the 90s or the 80s, okay, did you spend any time at kind of winter times there? Yeah, you remember these things were piled up outside, and that's pretty much what you would eat over Christmas, right? And I don't think you see that nowadays. I certainly hope you don't, because they look pretty bad already, right? So there we go. Now, Milkmaid, and I'm talking a little bit here about using the camera obscura in the old times, because it's something that David Hockney, and I'm sure you're familiar with David Hockney, has spent a lot of time talking about. He's somebody who obviously I admire, but he's spent a lot of time using modern types of media. He uses computers and apples and all sorts of things, but he's also done a lot of research looking into the great artists, and Vermeer certainly had a camera obscura. That, to describe that, is basically a pinhole camera, and it's a device through which you can actually look at a scene or a still life or whatever, and it just sharpens everything, so it's incredibly vivid. And in those days, if they had film, they'd have put it in, obviously, but they didn't, so that was what they used, though. So sort of exploring how photography and art have been quite closely twinned. This is one of the pictures that my mother and I were really inspired about. When we were going around these art galleries in northern England, we actually went to the Hull Art Gallery, and this is by a guy called Atkinson Grimshaw. He actually used a camera to actually to make this image, and what he did was he projected it onto a canvas, probably like this kind of size, and then he sort of drew, right? So he transformed what was a photograph, a glass plate photograph, onto a canvas, and then he drew it onto there. Slightly pointless, really. I mean, this is certainly what Braque and Picasso thought. They thought, well, why don't you just either have the photograph, right, which is perfectly reasonable, or create art? And so this is why I wanted to get onto the Cubist period. There's a guy called John Berger, who is a great art historian, passed away sadly, but one of the greats. And he talks a lot about what he described as the Cubist moment. And this is a Braque, but we can look at a Picasso, and they're almost identical, right, during this period. And that's actually, that's unique. From 1911 to 1914, Picasso and Braque, they did live in the same exhibit gallery, well, the same place. But I don't know of any other example of two artists whose work is completely interchangeable for 3 or 4 years. Okay, and they were inspired. They were really on a mission, and I'll talk about what that mission is in a moment. But what was interesting about it, of course, we all know that Van Gogh and Gauguin spent some time together, but their pictures are completely different from each other. There's no kind of, you know, common task there, and we all know that Gauguin stormed off and they were never friends again. But Picasso and Braque were on a mission, and I was referring earlier, so the folk have just popped in, to this idea of a congruence time where sciences and arts all meet. So what Picasso and Braque were trying to do, and I don't have time to go into the breakdown of a whole cubist picture, but basically you can see that this is a way of looking at the world and transforming it into a 2-dimensional image rather than trying to pretend it's a 3-dimensional image. So from the Renaissance onwards, we've been used to seeing people manipulate images so that they look like we're looking at a mirror, but in actual fact it's a mathematical construct. What Picasso and Braque were doing is saying, okay, let's make this a completely 2-dimensional space and describe it in a kind of molecular way. And at the same time, you had Einstein looking at the way the whole of time and reality and quantum physics and all of these things were built up. You have Stravinsky breaking down music and saying, well, this can be music too. And you also have Freud looking at the mind and saying, you know, we're not kind of in the same kind of way we are motivated by things which are not necessarily directly in control. We were not directly in control of these things. And the whole period, and of course it got interrupted by the First World War, was one of great hope. Okay. Unfortunately, the war happened, and then we have Dada, and then we have all of these, you know, Duchamp, and all of these kind of anti-capitalist type movements, because if they felt that if somebody created this terrible war, then that society must be moribund, right? But at this particular point, up until 1914, there was a lot of exploration, a lot of hope, not that much not that much money in a way, right? It wasn't a commercially driven type of period in certain ways, but there was this kind of mutual idea that, you know, humanity was moving forward, time was moving forward, we were going to go to a better future. And my point really with China is that that was what 1986 was like in China, actually. So you had actually not only in the arts, but you had basically Tian Zhuangzuan in cinema, you had Bajin and Wang Shuo in literature, you had Su Bing in art. I mean, these people at that time really believed they were creating something new, something Chinese, but something which was also in dialogue with the West. And this was a very special time, I think. And the reason that I bring all of that up is that I think in some ways the photographs that I took express something of that. And so we'll see some of those. This is Dashing Scholar. It's taken quite close to Zhongguancun, which is where I was living. A friend of mine, Chen Xiao, has translated and given a great commentary, which is in the book actually, and I really wanted to get the local perspective as well, or local perspectives. And he's got his bike, so obviously he's well on his way to being a respectable man with a girlfriend and all the rest of it. And he's got a book of algebra. Now, if you imagine this guy's actually obviously a university student, he's actually quite close to the Silicon Valley of Beijing. He's probably owning Lantau by now, I would imagine. But anyway, there we go. So, and a quick word on the bike. We mentioned earlier that the pictures do have some pictures of stuff in it. It wasn't a particularly capitalist society, China in '86, but it was certainly into stuff, like we all are, I think, you know. So he's got his bike, and one of the few Chinese people who've actually had a chance to see the exhibition I held at the FCC said, actually, I remember getting my bike. And he had his wife with him, okay? Obviously, in November, when we had the exhibition, there were very few people from China in Hong Kong. He was obviously here because he got marooned here, and he's about my age. He said, I got the bike. And she said, oh, yes, he got his bike. So she was kind of keen on him because he had a decent big bike. And then, you know, as we go through, you'll see people who've got the watch. So actually, I made a mistake in the book. I thought they were students, but the guy's got a watch. So obviously, he's married, you know, and on we go. So there's Dashing Scholar. This one, Billiard Girl. I love this picture, but basically, this is Beijing, and you'll see other pictures which are Datong. And Datong is considerably poorer than Beijing. And Chen Xiao, who was about 4 going to Beijing at this time, and as I say, gave me some commentaries on these pictures. He said this is actually state of the art. If you were in Beijing on the street playing this was pretty damn good. Because if you imagine just 10 years before, the streets were just chaos, right? For a whole decade. And so this is kind of like also a sign of normality and kids playing. And the other aspect to it is that there wasn't much to do in Beijing in 1986, to be honest. I mean, you kind of went home by 5, 6 o'clock. The television finished at 9. I mean, so street life is pretty much what you did. This one, Cold, Dust and Light. This is again Beijing, and this is actually quite close to a famous hospital, and this is a Ming Dynasty turret here. What I really like about this picture is the guy's hat. It just shows that people can be very stylish, even when they don't have much. Okay, and First Love. Now, there's the watch, you see. So, and also note that they're not actually holding hands, okay, because to hold hands in public would have been, actually pretty radical. But I think the picture just expresses what it expresses, really. This one is Young Heartthrob, and this is actually in the Hutong area, close to the Democracy Wall area. My Chinese is not brilliant, but a lot of these are about, I think, language courses and piano lessons and things like that. So Chen Xiao also talks about the fact that this is a period of time where people really wanted to learn. The outside world had been, obviously closed to China for many years. Do you want to let these folk in? We won't bite. Come in. You might even buy a book. Okay. Okay. So there we are. I mean, I don't know. I think when we were talking about a kind of idea, a hope, a certain apprehension, I think there's something expressed in that picture. And then this is a pensioner couple. I think they're married, right? Can we conclude they're married? I mean, there's something there. And I love the hands here. They're both kind of mirroring each other. I think our heartthrob is here. So this is taken the same day, maybe half an hour later. Yeah, I don't know. I love that picture. Then you've got Goodbye Mummy. Now, I'm presupposing some stuff here, but actually, if you go back to 86, China was at the beginning of this industrialization. Zhao Ziyang had just started encouraging joint ventures to open with foreign companies on the coast. And I kind of reckon that there's a woman here who's the mother of this child, because it was actually mainly the women who went into the factories to begin with and actually continued to be in the factories mainly. And he might not see his wife, and she might not see that baby for quite some time, because railway journeys were quite a big deal as well. So a little bit of conjecture perhaps, but it does, I think, capture a certain moment and a certain time. Scaffold. My wife comments around somewhere, but she was wondering, why on earth are you showing some of the later pictures? And I'll tell you, because this is a crazy picture only a young man would take. Why am I lying underneath these guys when they've got metal girders and, and they're not wearing harnesses, and I'm an idiot underneath? But anyway, so that's construction 86 style. Happy grandparents. I think we referred to earlier when people who, had been struggled against during the Cultural Revolution, which is virtually anybody who had an education of any kind. 10 years on, basically you can breathe and hope that this child's future is going to be a lot better. And obviously if you spend some time looking at the pictures, you see that this girl has got every mod com, if you like. The clothes are beautiful, she's beautifully turned out, so there's a lot of pride there. Beijing's Edith Piaf, Early Morning Light. There's another photographer called Marc Ribot, who's a Magnum photographer who was around in China in the 50s, and actually he went to Datong as well, and we'll get to some Datong pictures in a minute. But he took a fantastic picture of this very defiant Shanghai lady who was Chinese but looked as though she'd survived the Delhi Monde of Shanghai in the 30s, and this picture kind of reminds me of that a little bit. Now, the reason I want to dwell on this for a moment is that when we were talking a little bit earlier, or I was talking a little bit earlier about Picasso and Braque trying to actually change the format or trying to use the two-dimensional frame to change the format. That was kind of in my mind when I was taking pictures like this, because what I wanted to start to do, once I'd actually got used to taking pictures of the camera, and imagine this is like 3 or 4 months of just intense work, I mean 3 or 4 rolls of film a day, I wanted to actually express something what I felt about living in the streets of China at the time. And it's a pretty, it's a place of great surveillance. I mean, all societies now are surveyed. We've all got our phones and we're surveyed and everywhere. But states have always wanted to know what their citizens are doing, and China in '86 was no different. The difference was, of course, it was people who were always watching. So when you're actually on the streets, you always feel that you're being observed. And of course, it's got 1.4 billion people now, maybe 1.2 billion people then. You're never going to be alone in China, right? Or very rarely. So I'm beginning to try and express that a little bit by using the fact that I've got this square format and trying to crush people in a little bit, trying to get a little bit of an idea of the claustrophobia. I'm not sure if it comes across, but some of the pictures I think work better than others. You got this, which is one of the fish markets I referred to. I've got another picture which expresses the fish market. This one, actually, Datong. Now, Datong, this is one of the first images we have of Datong, and I spent a couple of weekends there and did a lot of photography around the place. And you can see it's significantly poorer than Beijing because they're having to get water from the pump, right? So Beijing has got plumbing in most of the houses, at least or the Soviet flats that I visited. Quite a lot of the, kind of communal toilets were still a thing, and you didn't want to be cycling behind a night soil wagon. That was pretty smelly at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. But Beijing at least had water, whereas these guys are having to get their water from the thing. Now, this picture could have been taken by Hedda Morrison 40 years before I took it, or it could have been taken, I think, centuries before. I'm not sure if these guys have walked all the way to this Tibetan temple. They may have done, not necessarily in this particular picture, but this is a Tibetan temple, I think, on the southwest of Beijing. And yeah, so this image, I think, is quite ancient, really, in a certain way. Now, this is less so. We talked about bikes, and of course, all these lusty boys with their bikes. There were quite a few traffic accidents. So this is actually about, being careful on your bike. And there we are. And it brings us to this, which is police altercation. And I've looked at this image a few times, obviously, and I think the guy is looking at me as he goes, right? As you can see. But actually, sometimes that whole thing could be to your advantage, because I remember I was with 2 university friends of mine, and I don't like doing this sort of thing, but they were quite keen to be cycled around on the back of the bike. And then, of course, the guy, one of these bikes, and the guy started getting quite violent. And I spoke a little bit of Mandarin, so I was kind of able to sort of call out to witnesses, because, of course, I knew there'd be somebody nearby. And, of course, then 2 women with the red armbands came out, and then there was a mini trial, and was it the foreigner's fault, or was this guy really trying to rip them off, and all the rest of it? So we kind of won our case, as it were. But this picture reminds me of that, because obviously there's some kind of traffic altercation, and suddenly the police are there, and the whole thing is getting a whole lot of witnesses and all the rest of it. This one, this is actually very close to, who knows Beijing quite well?
I remember those days. Yeah.
Gormao. It's actually near the Friendship shop.
Store,
yeah. Now, if you know Gormao now, it's 4 lanes each side, and maybe, at any moment. And these guys, also, there's a guy called Bill Jenner who I'm very, very impressed with, and he's a historian. I hope he's still alive. He would be quite old if he is. And he wrote something called The Tyranny of History. And he talks about a kind of subversive humor in China. And I think, I don't know, you can see it expressed all the time. And I think these guys are kind of having fun. I hope somebody doesn't go down there. But anyway, we'll talk a little bit about time, if you'll indulge me. Because one thing that I think photography as an art form can do better than most is express time. And take a single second of time and express something with it. I mean, that's one thing it has advantage at. And I'll also talk about time in terms of fine art, if you don't mind. So this is Cartier-Bresson, famous image, and I think it expresses what it expresses. It's a beautiful image capturing a single moment. This is mine from a couple of weeks ago from Puyo, so not quite as brilliant as Cartier-Bresson, but anyway, you get an idea. And this is also from the time of the 80s, so this is actually just around the corner from the canteen where I was eating at Beishada. So, as we all said in those days, China will be nice when it's finished. It is finished, I think. Yeah. And this is actually by Sorolla, a Spanish artist. Anybody familiar with this guy? Oh.
He paints whites really lovely.
Oh.
Brilliantly, yeah. That's the only thing I know about him. He always paints children in lovely white clothes and he paints whites wonderfully.
Fantastic. Well, I was never familiar with him until about 2 years ago because they had this Master of Light exhibition in London.
Exactly it.
Right.
That's how I came to it.
Right. So in the early 19th century, early 20th century, he did a big tour of London, Paris, and Chicago, and London, he didn't sell a single picture, so that's probably why in our collections we don't know them in the National or anything like that. He's a total revelation to me because A, he's a really nice guy. I mean, some of the artists really are not, but this guy, you just see his pictures and they're fantastic. But B, he did this en plein. He actually had a canvas and he painted as if it was a photograph, right? And he would insist on doing that, so I think he's just brilliant. And it also kind of mirrors with the pictures there. So he's trying to express something in time with painting, okay? So it's kind of interesting. There are pictures which do express time in a different sort of way. So this is the 18th century artist I was talking about earlier. He's a Zen monk. I can tell you his name. Oh, there you are, Nagasawa Rosetsu. He did that in 2 hours. And it's the length of this vibe, right, if you can imagine, right? So that's expression of something in time, right? This is something that Chinese and Japanese art can do. They can just be, incredibly expressive and show 40 years of expertise in like an hour or even 15 minutes or even 5 seconds, This one's a sort of slightly different take on time, and this is Nicolas Poussin, which I think Pier della Francesca would have some sympathy with. And this is a beautiful picture, which is actually at the Abu Dhabi Louvre. And it's different people's approach to time, funnily enough, because you've got John the Baptist and you've got Christ, and Christ is being baptized, and this is an eternal moment, right? I mean, this shines through forever, eternal moment. You've got the dove there, okay, and there's various other people reacting to this, and it's a very clever picture. And I'm sure in those days, long before photography and anything like that, this picture would be studied very, very, very closely. And you'll have people who are having a picnic at the top there, so they're completely immune to anything going on eternally. You've got various people shying away, saying, I don't believe this, I think it's a whole charlatan thing, various people reacting. And then you've got these two in a moment of complete out of timeness, if you like. Then you have this one, which actually W.H. Auden wrote a poem about, and I will find my notes and I'll share it with you. Does anybody know this image? Okay. It's by Bruegel, as it says, 18th century. And this is actually, we're getting quite close to our own time in one way. This is what Auden says. And the expensive, delicate ship must have seen something amazing. A boy falling out of the sky. And there he is, there's Icarus. And nowhere, but had somewhere to get onto and sailed calmly on. So this is now hang on, there was a bit missing. He should have an iPhone here. The click didn't work, I'm afraid. But you can imagine everybody is absorbed in something else in this picture. And it's kind of like quite modern. I mean, we're talking 200 or 300 years ago, but it captures a secular modern moment where something happens to somebody and everybody else just carries on as if nothing else is happening. Okay, I think we're close to the end now. I'm going to run through some pictures just to show you, really. I mean, this is Children Under Mao, quite close to the university campus. Again, these are obviously Cadre's kids. They're all beautifully turned out, but I think that class is going to be lively, to say the least. This is the artist. At the time when I was actually in China, Corot, the 18th century, early 18th century artist, was very, very popular. The landscape artists were the ones, and they wanted to really, people really wanted to know about oil painting and that kind of thing. Then this is the one I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, the Xinjiang free market. This sign says don't cheat people, okay? And basically you can only sell vegetables, okay? And treat your fellow citizens very well, all of these kind of extortions, no undercover, no meat, all kinds of stuff like that. So, and this is historic in terms of the fact that actually this is the first free market in China. And I think it did open in Beijing in around about 85, 86. And actually the peasants, as they're referred to as peasants by in China, not derogatory, they were the first to get rich. Deng Xiaoping's reforms were for the countryside. And actually at the time when I was actually studying Chinese history as well, the cities were still fairly backward. When I went to Shanghai in the same period, 85, 86, 86, Shanghai hadn't changed at all since the 40s. So, you know, the countryside was moving quite a lot. Hedgehog Man, I'm afraid he's selling them to eat. I'm not sure he's really keen on that one, but yeah, there we are. Northwest corner of Gugong, a lot of people take their wedding shots here. I was cycling around, and this would have been around about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, I suspect, and I passed this way most days, and I think I must have taken this picture because for some reason these guys are in pajamas. I don't quite know why. Anyway, the eyes have it. Now this is actually a scale to check whether your citizen is actually cheating you or not. It's actually a government scale. So I'm not sure, we'll probably read too much into these pictures, but this could be the guy and he's thinking, why is she checking on my, you know, order really? Because that actually is a way of making sure you're not being cheated. Students on the stele, people have said they look like the Beatles. I can see what they kind of mean. The one thing is true, that you wouldn't have people sitting on a 17th century Qing dynasty artifact any longer. I mean, the way that antiques were kind of just trashed in that time is quite extraordinary. Now, these are the pictures that my wife Carmen wondered why I smuggled in, but partly because I like steam trains, and partly because I wanted to show you this one. Not a particularly great picture, but I'm actually underneath it, and I'm thinking, I'm underneath a steam train? How mad must I have been? So I'm here, fortunately, but only through the grace of God. Now this is one I took 2 weeks ago. We've recently moved to Jordan, and I think it's a very cool period. And Lulu, I know her as Lulu, and apparently she's a singer, and people may actually know her as well. But she was very happy to pose for this photo. And you know, as we say, the beat goes on in Hong Kong. So still taking photographs. And thank you. That's it. Okay. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Patrick. So now we'll take questions. If you've got a question, just put your hand up a little bit and I'll move the mic nearer to you. So, anyone?
Or sharing anything that...
Yeah, I just appreciate. I appreciated seeing some of Beijing in 1986. I moved there in 1990 as a student at Beijing Yuan-Shiyan, and so some of the pictures, I remember a time that you can't go back to now because I go there frequently, and it's obviously completely different. So it was wonderful to see some of the pictures because it brought back a lot of memories of winter and the charcoal smell in the air. You know, there was unique smells that are probably gone now, and so thank you. I appreciate it very much.
Okay, great. Yeah. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Anybody else? I'm just going to stand near you so you don't blast Phil's ears out.
It's fine. I just wanted to ask, what is the first question we nearly always ask? How did you end up in China in 1986?
That's a good question. I was at Leeds University, and Leeds University had and still has a very strong China department. So I was studying history of art and English, actually. But a lot of my friends came back with these great stories of China, and I thought, well, I'd really like to go out and see that for myself. So that's and also I think I showed the picture of my mum and dad earlier, and my dad had actually been in Shanghai when he was about 19. He was called up to be in the Royal Navy, and lucky man, he didn't actually have to fight anybody, but he had this kind of grand tour of Asia, and China being one of them. So it was a very cool photograph of him with a pipe, a pair of Bermudas, and a book with Shanghai Bund behind him on a battleship. And I thought, that looks fun, I want to do that. So I guess those two reasons.
Okay, any more questions? Yeah.
Just wondering how aware were normal Chinese, ordinary Chinese people of the rest of the world and what was happening in the rest of the world, and how were you received by them?
Oh, that's a great question. It really depended on who you met, So obviously, the people I was teaching with, who were English language teachers at the university, were fairly familiar with a lot of the things that you would normally associate. Some people were completely unaware. So, for instance, I remember having a train journey. We went from Beijing to Guangzhou, and during the journey, it took 3 days, 3 nights, and people would say, "Do you have money in England?" You say, "Well, yeah, we have money." "No, but do you have the same money in England?" Right? So it was, quite. There was very odd things like, I used to have to go to a public bath, and this was like a kind of football field full of beds, right? And you stood on the bed to change because you didn't want to stand on the floor. And you went into this public bath, and the guy who, I think the worst uniform of any job I've ever seen is this guy's uniform, because he had a pair of wellies and a towel, and he would rub kind of rather filthy people with soap. That must be one of the worst jobs I would imagine. And I was in there, and I was standing there actually trying to get changed in this place, and this voice sort of popped up and said, "How much pig iron does England produce every year?" So some of these exchanges were very strange indeed,
Okay, I've got a question about the camera. Do you still use it today?
I do.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a bugger. I tell you, I actually had to take it to repair, and then I find it really difficult to change the film. And I think there's probably something a little bit wrong with it. It's a great camera, and the lenses are terrific, but it's not what I would choose today, because I only get 12 pictures, and then you have to change, and then
Where do you get the film for that?
Oh, you can still get it. Yeah, there's still places that sell film. Yeah.
You develop yourself?
No, that's one part of the whole camera thing I never got, actually. I don't like sulfuric smells, I think, so actually Danny, I bring this up because it is for sale, 2,000 Hong Kong dollars, framed. There it is, beautiful. This is done on Hummelhullerlof paper. I said that really very well, didn't I? And Danny Chow did the production on it, and he does my production if it's for an exhibition or something. It's Chow Digital. So the whole artistry of that is a different story, but one that I can only tell you I do that bit,
Nice. That's a question. Who's developing your film if you're taking 3 or 4 rolls a day? Sorry, if you were taking 3 or 4 rolls a day when you were going through Beijing, like how was that entire process of actually getting the film washed and printing together?
Oh, that was actually quite simple, to be honest, because there was a couple of dark rooms. One still may have some of my negatives because I didn't collect the final batch, so you just go in, and then they would actually process it for you. This was actually a popular camera, so a 120 format was not unusual, and there were places on 140. The other thing for me was it was relatively cheap, because I wasn't terribly affluent, but I was more affluent than most Chinese people at that time. So this was the one thing that I could indulge in. Before, if you compare to the time when I was referring to a bit earlier, when we first started about being at university, I didn't have the money. But in China, it was actually really cheap to buy the film, and the developing was really cheap. The only problem is, as we started this talk, is that I had them all in a tight roll and didn't really look at them for 30 years. So it was actually when, I think it's Mr. Young, on Jaffe Road, on Colour Deluxe, actually spent his time straightening them and scanning them, that we have these images now.
Yeah.
Sure.
Right.
2 questions, actually, if you don't mind. So firstly, and it might be a harder one, you talked about sort of Braque and Picasso and the changes in science influencing photography and how you wanted to take photos at the time then. how has that changed from the 80s to now, and what is it now? Which sort of artists or scientific movements are now sort of forming or influencing photography? That was one. If that's a tricky one, maybe.
Okay, I'll have a go. But, you know, yeah, okay.
The second one was I'm just curious, how has it changed taking photographs of people? Are people harder or easier to take photos of today? So you're getting quite sort of intimate pictures of people.
Sure.
Are they permissive, more so, less so? Now that photography has become more mainstream, everyone. Thank you.
Okay, no, those are two great questions. Let me go for the second one first and give a bit of subliminal thought to the first one. There was actually a bit of a documentary I saw of a French lady photographer of a certain age. She's probably very famous, but I personally don't know her name. But it was a documentary I kind of tuned in on. And she was doing what I would normally, one would be doing here. But of course, in modern day Paris, she got into a lot of an argument because, she's a certain age, she's thinking she can take the pictures like she would before, and people get very offended because you think, how are you going to use this image? What's going to happen to it? There's many things that can happen to images, right? So, and we're all into a very different sort of sensitivity about children's rights and children's protection and everything else like that. So I think it has changed a lot, and also just the ubiquity of images. I think about my Yorkshire heritage, which I can't claim. Basically, if I think about my great uncle Willie, who lived most of his life either working as a cloth finisher or then on the piece of land that they had to, make, vegetables and look after the chickens and stuff like that. The amount of images that they had and the kind of, whole pressure of modern life is very different. And that was what China was like to some degree. The amount of images that you're, kind of bombarded with today, comparative to that period of time, is very different. And to answer your first, I'm not sure if that helps, but yeah. And I think so I wanted to show you that last picture because I wanted to show that I could take a color picture, because actually black and white's easy, right? Because we all dream in black and white. But color is really difficult because we all take color pictures, right? So to actually take a color picture that works, I think you've actually got to work that much harder. What I'd like to talk a little bit about is now I'm losing my train of thought a little bit, but so photography, I think you have to work harder. And what I'd want to talk about a little bit is that transition from Picasso and 1911 to 14 to onwards, because what you get then is after the First World War, you have Duchamp, who I think is a genius, right? I mean, I don't know if people are familiar with Marcel Duchamp. One of the very clever images he did was he took a urinal, something that men wee in, and he got somebody else to sign "R. Mutt" on it, and he got it put in an exhibition. Okay, and that was 1919. Why did he do all of those things? Well, partly because it was a challenge to the group he joined. They said, you can exhibit anything. We are against any rules. So he said, okay, there. And so they threw him out, unsurprisingly, So, that was part of his point. But there was a deeper point related to the decadence of a society or a capitalist system that can create the First World War. I mean, everybody was absolutely appalled by what had happened. I guess armaments and technology had decimated a whole generation of people. But my view on the art movement now, and this is probably a little bit of a kind of, I wouldn't say it's the most intelligent or erudite of views, but we're carrying on with Duchamp, right? And we've kind of got that. So I think, as David Hockney agrees, fortunately, I'm in good company, that whatever you create should at least have some kind of beauty to it. I mean, it can be expressive, it can be whatever else, but I think, the idea of having an image which is this big and the explanation which is that big is kind of a bit dull, but anyway, that's just my view.
Okay, so we're going to close down the broadcast there, but not before saying, one, thank you for a brilliant broadcast, and two, to plug your book.
There we are.
Track of Time, Moments of Transition, is for sale in this shop for $300. 10% of that.
Oh yes, so go on. Yep.
Okay, so 10% of that goes to charity, which is good. It's a cancer charity called Children's Cancer Therapy Development Institute. All right.
I'll take 1 minute to talk about the charity just for a
Yeah,
moment.
sure, sure.
And you're getting it cheap, by the way. There's a 10%, because it's 400 in other places. So
Oh,
there
okay.
you go. So there you are. Vibe is...
Yeah, wait a minute. Things are going to change.
Second thing is the cancer charity is based in Oregon, and actually children's cancer, this is the unique children's cancer charity in terms of the fact that they actually create drugs for children. I thought that was quite a common thing, right? But apparently not, because obviously the drugs that we would be taking as older people for cancer are not going to be suitable for kids, because obviously we'd be tolerant of having some kind of side effects which are just not going to be possible for kids of 6, 7, 10. So what they do is an awful lot of research with the pharmaceutical companies to actually progress specific treatment for the kids. So 10% of the book and 10% of this lovely picture goes to that charity. So, and thank you all for spending time with us. It was great. Thank you.